The risk today is not a deliberate war, it is a misread signal, a pause, a silence, an assumption made in the dark. Donald Trump speaks loudly on trade, on tariffs, on economic rivalry with China, but on war, on Taiwan, on whether America would actually fight, his voice becomes unclear. That uncertainty matters, because in the Indo-Pacific, peace is not maintained by goodwill, it is maintained by expectations, by what each side believes the other will do when the moment comes. Beijing is watching, so are Japan, the Philippines, South Korea. When ambiguity shifts from strategic to unintended, the danger rises quietly. If you want to understand why the next crisis may not begin with a decision, but with a misunderstanding, stay with me, because to grasp where this is heading, we first need to understand what this ambiguity really means and why it exists at all. At the center of this story is a subtle but dangerous shift. For decades, Washington practiced what it called strategic ambiguity, especially over Taiwan. The logic was simple. If Beijing was unsure whether the US would intervene, it might hesitate. If Taipei was unsure of automatic protection, it might avoid provocation. Ambiguity, used carefully, was a tool of stability. But what we are seeing now is something different. Not a calculated silence, but an unclear position. Trump questions alliances. He criticizes partners for not paying enough. He signals reluctance toward foreign wars. At the same time, he surrounds himself with China hawks, while figures with deep business ties to China hold influence nearby. The result is confusion. Allies do not know how firm U.S. guarantees really are, and adversaries cannot tell where the real red lines lie. To understand why this matters so much, we need to step back and look at how this fragile balance was built in the first place. To understand the danger, we have to go back to how this rivalry was shaped. For years, China rose inside a system built and protected by the United States. Trade expanded, supply chains deepened, military tensions were managed, not solved, but power never stands still. Under Xi Jinping, Beijing began to define its red lines more clearly, none more important than Taiwan. At the same time, China invested heavily in military modernization, not to match the US everywhere, but to dominate its near seas, the East China Sea, the South China Sea. This was not about a sudden war. It was about shifting the balance slowly, relentlessly, until intervention became too costly. Washington responded cautiously, maintaining alliances, avoiding direct confrontation. The assumption was that time would reduce tensions. Instead, time changed the equation. As China's capabilities grew, the margin for error shrank. And that brings us to the first real stress test, a moment where theory met reality and the system began to creak. Then the pressure became visible, not in a declaration of war, but in movement. Taiwan felt it first. After President Lai Ching-te took office, Beijing responded with forceful signals. 3 major military drills. Operations rehearsed not for symbolism but for control. Quarantine scenarios. Port closures. Isolation without invasion. This was the message. We can tighten the space around you without firing a shot. At the same time, the skies changed. According to RCDA, in just the first 8 days of 2025, more PLA aircraft were detected around Taiwan than in all of January 2024. Not an accident, a demonstration, and further south another signal. The Chinese Coast Guard's largest vessel entered the Philippines' EEZ, a direct challenge to a formal U.S. treaty ally. Each move was calibrated, below the threshold of war, above the threshold of comfort. If you're still watching, pause for a moment. Ask yourself, at what point does pressure become a crisis? Because what looks manageable on the surface often hides a deeper mechanism underneath. And that is where we need to go next. What we are seeing is not chaos. It is a system at work. Beijing's strategy is built on normalization. make the extraordinary routine, make resistance feel futile. Continuous patrols, persistent air incursions, constant presence. This is gray zone pressure. It exploits a gap between peace and war, between treaty language and real-world response. The PLA does not need to defeat Taiwan or the Philippines outright. It only needs to outlast them. Over time, every unanswered move shrinks the space for response. For Washington, the dilemma is severe. Respond too strongly and risk escalation. Respond too weakly and deterrence erodes. This is where ambiguity becomes dangerous. If Beijing believes the US will hesitate, it can push further and further until any effective response requires US forces to operate close to Taiwan itself. That would likely cross Xi Jinping's red line. This is how systems fail, not suddenly, but gradually, and once that threshold is crossed, the second crisis does not announce itself. It arrives already in motion. Then the tension tightens, because pressure, when left unanswered, invites acceleration. This is the second escalation point, not hypothetical, operational. In the South China Sea, gray zone tactics intensify, ramming, water cannons, persistent shadowing. For countries like the Philippines, the imbalance is stark. The PLA outnumbers, outclasses, outlasts. Without visible US backing, every response becomes riskier than restraint. And around Taiwan, the logic darkens: a blockade or a quarantine, presented as law enforcement, not war. Each step tests resolve, not just Taipei's, Washington's. If the US hesitates even briefly, the signal is sent, deterrence weakens, confidence erodes, and once Beijing believes intervention is unlikely, it no longer needs patience. This is the most dangerous moment, when restraint is mistaken for retreat, because from here, the system does not reset. It moves forward fast, compressed, and with far less room to stop what comes next. Now let me bring this closer to you, because strategy is abstract, but consequences are not. If you live in Taiwan, every aircraft overhead is a question mark, not just about safety, but about abandonment. If you are in the Philippines, each encounter at sea asks the same thing: will anyone back us if this goes too far? This is how uncertainty feels. Not dramatic, exhausting. You don't wake up to war. You wake up to doubt. Doubt erodes confidence. Confidence erodes resistance. And that is the real target. If you've ever wondered why credibility matters more than firepower, this is why. Because once people stop believing help will come, they adjust their choices. They comply, they accommodate, they look elsewhere. If this analysis helps you see the system more clearly, share it, because understanding is also a form of defense. But the impact does not stop here, because when trust weakens locally, the shockwaves travel far beyond any single coastline. What happens next does not stay local, because the Indo-Pacific is not just a security arena, it is the core of the global system. If US credibility weakens here, every capital notices. Japan watches Taiwan and calculates its own exposure. South Korea weighs deterrence on a divided peninsula. And across Southeast Asia, the lesson spreads quietly. Security guarantees fade faster than trade flows. China understands this leverage. It is already the largest trading partner of Japan, the Philippines, and South Korea. It dominates critical supply chains, key technologies. If Washington appears uncertain, Beijing does not need coercion. Influence follows gravity. Countries hedge, then realign, not because they want to, but because systems reward certainty. This is how regional hegemony forms, not through invasion, but through absence. And once that shift begins, reversing it becomes far harder than preventing it. Which brings us to the final question, not what might happen tomorrow, but what paths still remain before the system locks into place. From here, the future splits, not into destiny, but into three paths. The first is restraint. The U.S. reduces uncertainty, clarifies commitments, reassures allies, not with threats, but with consistency. In this scenario, Beijing recalculates. Pressure continues, but escalation slows. The system holds. The second path is drift. Ambiguity persists. Signals remain mixed. Allies hedge quietly. China advances incrementally. No single moment shocks the world, but the balance tilts. Deterrence erodes without collapsing. And then there is the third path, acceleration. If Xi Jinping concludes that the Trump administration will not intervene, timing becomes decisive. Gray zone pressure intensifies, a blockade becomes plausible, and once confidence in PLA superiority solidifies, delay makes less sense than action. Ironically, even increased U.S. arms sales to Taiwan could backfire, serving as justification for preemptive moves. None of these futures are inevitable, but systems once set in motion reward clarity and punish hesitation. And that leaves us with one final insight and one final choice. Here is the hard truth. Wars rarely begin because leaders want them. They begin because systems fail to communicate intent. Xi Jinping has said the Thucydides trap is not inevitable. He is right, but avoiding it requires discipline, clarity, and restraint on both sides. For the United States, the priority is simple but not easy. Reduce uncertainty, not through bluster, not through silence, but through credible, consistent signals in the Indo-Pacific. Because if deterrence fails, the cost will not be abstract. It will be Taiwan occupied, allies recalculating, a region reordered without a single treaty being formally broken. And once trust is lost, it is not restored by speeches. If this analysis helped you see how fragile the system really is, stay with this channel, because the next video will go deeper into how deterrence actually collapses step by step. History does not warn us loudly, it whispers. The question is whether this time we are listening.